There is a reason you have found yourself here, listening to words that feel less like information and more like a mirror. Somewhere beneath your daily routines and relationship anxieties, another intelligence has been moving, quiet, patient, ancient. Jung called it the unconscious, the wider psyche that arranges outer events to meet inner necessity. Perhaps you call it fate or timing or coincidence, but the very fact that you are hearing this now carries the faint shimmer of synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence in which life itself seems to answer a question you hadn't yet dared to speak aloud. Because there is a certain kind of woman a man will not try to control, not because she plays a game better than others, but because on some deep instinctual level he knows he cannot possess her without losing himself. You may already sense that this woman is not some distant archetype. She is a latent possibility within you, a configuration of soul that has been quietly waiting for its moment. For years, you may have been trained subtly or explicitly to make love into a performance, be gentle but not weak intelligent, but not intimidating, sensual, but not too much. These prescriptions are not neutral. In Jungian language, they belong to the persona, the socially approved mask we craft to gain acceptance and avoid rejection. The persona is not inherently false. It allows you to function, to work, to flirt, to be appropriate at dinner tables and in messages. But when a woman's life orbits entirely around maintaining this mask, when her sense of worth rises and falls with a man's attention, something inside her begins to wither. She becomes, in psychological terms, identified with the persona and cut off from the deeper ground of the self. The organizing center of the psyche that holds her innate wholeness, the blueprint of who she truly is beyond all roles. You might know this as the quiet sadness that appears even in relationships that look perfect from the outside, the dull ache that whispers, "This cannot be all I am." Most romantic advice you encounter speaks directly to the persona. It tells you how to appear, how to text, how to calibrate responses so as not to scare him away. It teaches techniques of seduction while treating your inner life, your dreams, your rage, your wild creativity as background noise. But the woman who haunts a man's memory, who lingers in his psyche long after he has scrolled past countless other faces, does not originate in technique. She emerges when the axis of her life quietly shifts from orienting around his desire to orienting around her own inner center. This shift rarely begins dramatically. It often starts with the smallest crack in the old pattern of faint discomfort in situations you used to tolerate. A delayed reply that once made you anxiously perform more sweetness now lands differently in your body. Instead of scrambling to fix it, you notice a tightening in your chest, a fatigue in your bones. Jung would say that libido psychic energy is withdrawing from an old configuration. What once felt exciting now tastes strangely flat. The castle you tried to build around a man's agreement reveals itself as a kind of golden cage, and you find yourself staring at the bars. These moments are thresholds. They are the psyche's way of saying the old spell is breaking. When you sense that a man is more interested in being adored than in knowing who you are, your body often knows before your mind does. Your stomach clenches when you minimize your opinion so he won't feel threatened. Your throat tightens when you laugh at something that quietly wounds you. These somatic signals are not weaknesses. They are messages from the unconscious self, knocking from below the surface, insisting you can no longer abandon yourself to be chosen. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole, less governed by outer expectations and more guided by an inner authority. At first, it does not look like power. It looks like confusion, like a woman sitting on the edge of her bed late at night, phone in hand, realizing with a mix of grief and clarity that she is tired of negotiating her worth through his reactions. The unconscious equilibrium, where she sacrificed her needs to maintain external harmony, has been disturbed. The crack in her persona has appeared, and once that crack appears, light starts to leak in. What begins as a small crack soon widens into a threshold, and every threshold in a woman's psychological life marks a descent. This is the phase most people resist, the liminal zone where the old identity no longer fits, but the new one has not yet arrived. In Jungian psychology, liminality is not an obstacle, but the very space in which transformation becomes possible. The persona loosens its once rigid outline, turning porous, and the raw material of the psyche rises like mist from a hidden lake. It can feel disorienting, even lonely, yet beneath that unease is a quiet pulse of truth. You are entering the underworld of your own soul, not as punishment, but as initiation. The liminal phase often begins with withdrawal, not from the world, but from the compulsions that governed you. You respond more slowly to messages that used to send adrenaline through your veins. You feel less inclined to explain yourself, to justify your emotions, to chase clarity from someone who never offered it freely. This withdrawal is not apathy. It is the unconscious reclaiming psychic energy that had been poured into people's fantasies and performances that could no longer sustain you. Jung described this as a necessary contraction, the psyche's preparation for deeper work. Your dreams may shift here, stranger, darker, more symbolic. Perhaps you dream of locked rooms or flooded houses of wild animals lurking just beyond a door. These are not random. They reflect the psyche's descent into the symbolic underworld, the place where shadow material waits to be acknowledged. The underworld, psychologically speaking, is not a realm of evil. It is the repository of everything you disowned in order to be loved. Your anger, your ambition, your erotic intensity, your refusal to be controlled, your desire for a life larger than what anyone imagined for you. A woman does not become unforgettable because she has no shadow. She becomes unforgettable because she has met it. The men who fear her do not fear her beauty. They fear the way she carries her own darkness with dignity, the way she refuses to amputate parts of herself to soothe their fragility. When you descend into your unconscious, you begin to encounter precisely these forbidden qualities. You may feel inexplicable bursts of anger at situations you once tolerated. You may feel desire awakening in you, not just sexual desire, but a deep eros, the life force that animates your creativity, your passions, your future. Jung wrote that eros is the connective principle, the feminine psychological energy that binds life into meaning. When eros is suppressed, a woman becomes accommodating, agreeable, easy to digest. When eros awakens, she becomes magnetic in a way no technique can manufacture. The men who once found you predictable may sense this shift before you do. Something changes in your posture, your voice, the way your eyes linger on the horizon of your own becoming. You are no longer oriented toward winning approval. You are oriented toward discovering who you are beneath the layers of performance. And this, paradoxically, is when some men begin to feel an unexpected insecurity, not because you threaten them deliberately, but because you no longer belong to the psychological economy they are used to. They do not know where you go when your gaze softens and you disappear into thought. They do not know what stirs in you when you no longer accommodate every request. They sense that losing you is not something they could prevent through charm or pressure. This insecurity, his not yours, is the first sign that the polarity has shifted. You are no longer a predictable harbor. You are becoming the open sea. And the sea cannot be owned. Yet every descent reaches a deeper layer, one that does not involve men at all. This is where the feminine shadow meets the collective unconscious, the vast inherited reservoir of mythic patterns that shape our psyches without our awareness. Here, you may encounter not just your personal wounds, but the wounds of women who came before you. You might feel grief that seems older than your own life, a heaviness in the chest that cannot be traced to a single event. Jung called this transgenerational material the psychic inheritance passed down through the mother line. In this space, you realize that your patterns were never merely yours. The tendency to shrink, to please, to maintain harmony at the cost of your truth, These are echoes of generations of women who learned that survival required silence. Your descent becomes not only an act of personal healing, but of ancestral liberation. You begin to understand that every boundary you set, every truth you speak, every moment you choose yourself, is a moment of breaking a centuries-old pattern. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the woman who once sought validation begins to stand in the quiet center of her own being. As you move deeper into this inner terrain, another figure emerges from the shadows, the father. Not necessarily the literal father, though he may appear in memory or dream, but the father complex, the internalized image of masculine authority you have carried since childhood. In Jungian terms, the father complex represents the psychic imprint of how you learn to relate to the masculine principle: structure, validation, approval, protection, judgment. Even women with loving fathers carry some version of this complex because no father is perfect, and every psyche interprets experiences symbolically, not literally. Here, in the half-light of the unconscious, you begin to see how much of your longing for male attention was never about the man in front of you. It was about earning the approval of an internal father image you have been trying to satisfy for decades. You can feel it somatically, the quickened breath when a man withdraws, the panic when he grows distant, the impulse to fix the connection even when you know it is harming you. This is the complex in motion, the visceral memory of a young girl trying to secure love from a source she experienced as powerful, unpredictable, or conditional. Jung wrote that complexes behave like partial personalities, autonomous fragments of psyche that operate outside conscious control. When the father complex is activated, you may find yourself shrinking, smoothing over tension, minimizing your voice, or bending your boundaries to avoid losing affection. Not because you consciously choose this, but because the complex, ancient, and emotionally charged grips the steering wheel of your behavior. The queen within you cannot yet stand fully because the child within you is terrified of disappointing the internal father. This realization is not meant to shame you. It is a profound moment of liberation, for when you recognize the complex, you no longer confuse it with fate. You begin to differentiate between the man in front of you and the archetypal phantom behind him. And slowly, your psyche begins to reclaim the authority you once projected outward. The masculine principle once sought in men is gradually integrated within you as inner structure, clarity, discernment, direction. In Jungian terms, this is the integration of the animus. The inner masculine function that once developed gives a woman the capacity to define her mission, uphold her boundaries, and act from her own authority. As the father complex loosens its grip, something extraordinary begins to happen. The emotional energy that once flowed toward male validation turns inward, activating the deep wellspring of eros, your creative libido. Jung understood libido not merely as sexual desire, but as the prime psychic energy that animates life. When it is directed outward toward men who cannot hold it, it becomes obsession. When reclaimed, it becomes power. You may notice this shift in unexpected ways: a sudden desire to create, to build, to write, to study, to travel alone, to pursue something that once felt impossible. Your life becomes less about being chosen and more about choosing. The world that once felt small and constricted begins to expand. You feel a brightness in your chest when you imagine futures that do not revolve around attachment. You taste freedom not as detachment from love, but as fidelity to your own soul. And this, paradoxically, is the moment when you become most magnetic, not because you aim to attract, but because your consciousness rises. Men intuitively sense when a woman is no longer psychologically dependent on them. They feel it in the way you pause before responding, the way you decline invitations that conflict with your purpose, the way you maintain your center, even when someone else loses theirs. This equanimity is not coldness, it is sovereignty. It is the animus functioning in its highest form, no longer tyrannical, no longer vulnerable to collapse, but aligned with the self. In dreams, this stage may appear as a mountain, a staircase, a throne, or a towering tree, symbolic images of ascent, integration, and inner authority. The feminine within you begins to stand tall, rooted yet expansive, soft yet unyielding. And when a man approaches you now, he is approaching a woman who has survived her own underworld, confronted her shadow, liberated her lineage, and reclaimed her eros from the hands of ghosts. This is not the end of the journey. This is the moment before the ascent, when the new self gathers strength to rise. As the inner architecture of your psyche reshapes itself around truth, rather than longing, a new horizon opens. It is subtle at first, an unfamiliar spaciousness, as though the air around you has thinned and brightened. This is not euphoria. It is clarity. The ego, once entangled in fantasies of being saved, begins to yield to a deeper center of gravity, the self. Jung described the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, the totality of who you are and who you are becoming, the inner sovereign that guides your individuation. When the ego aligns with the self, a woman steps into a kind of psychological altitude. Her life begins to move according to an inner rhythm rather than external demands. What does this feel like in lived experience? Imagine walking through your day with a sensation of steady presence, as if your spine carries the memory of every boundary you reclaimed in the underworld. You notice the small ways people try to pull you into old patterns, guilt, urgency, manipulation, flattery, and you feel less reactive. The hooks do not penetrate as deeply. You sense the difference between connection and consumption, between genuine intimacy and emotional dependency. The feminine in you, once conditioned to soften at every sign of disapproval, now holds her shape with quiet dignity. Men sense this shift instinctively. The ones who once treated your time as abundant now feel the gravity of your absence. They notice that you are not immediately available, not because you are performing aloofness, but because your life is full. You no longer collapse your schedule around theirs. You no longer silence your opinions to preserve harmony. You remain warm, but the warmth no longer comes at the cost of your truth. And this paradoxically ignites a unique form of male insecurity, not rooted in fear of abandonment, but in recognition of your independence. He realizes you could walk away without losing yourself. Some men find this terrifying. Others find it awakening. But either way, the dynamic has changed. You are no longer the safe harbor. You are the open sea. And the sea, vast and sovereign, does not bend to desire. She invites it. Yet, sovereignty does not mean isolation. In fact, this stage of individuation often brings a deeper longing, not for attachment, but for resonance. You no longer crave a partner to complete you. You seek one who can meet you at altitude. This is the psychological loneliness of the queen archetype, not a poverty of connection, but the rarefied air of someone who has integrated her shadow, reclaimed her eros, and touched the vastness of the collective unconscious. In this altitude, companionship becomes a choice made from fullness. You feel it in your chest as slow-burning warmth, rather than the frantic flutter of dependency. You begin to understand what Jung meant when he said that the right partner is not someone who fills your emptiness, but someone who helps you realize your wholeness. The man who approaches you in this state must be internally spacious, psychologically mature, unthreatened by the brightness of your becoming. This is why a woman at this stage becomes both rare and unforgettable. She no longer offers the balm of comfort alone. She offers challenge, vitality, presence. She offers the kind of love that expands a man's psyche rather than shrinking hers. Your relationships naturally recalibrate. Some fall away without the need for confrontation. Others transform. A few deepen into bonds that feel mythic. But the most important relationship, the one that now anchors your inner constellation, is the one with yourself. You begin to witness your own life as though standing on sacred ground. Decisions align more easily. Desires sharpen. Self-abandonment becomes impossible. And you sense, perhaps for the first time, that your path has significance not because of external achievements, but because it is yours. This expanding consciousness does not make you invulnerable, it makes you authentic. And authenticity, when aligned with the self, becomes a beacon not of perfection, but of presence. You begin to understand that the true feminine does not seduce through performance. She magnetizes through essence. And so you rise not as an imitation of strength, but as its embodiment, not above the world, but deeply within it, rooted in your lineage, your shadow, your eros, your truth. As you ascend fully into this new psychological landscape, something extraordinary reveals itself not suddenly, but with the gradual inevitability of dawn spreading across a long, dark horizon. Individuation is not a single moment of enlightenment, but a continuous homecoming, a process in which each step brings the ego into deeper alignment with the self. You begin to understand that sovereignty is not a pose, not an attitude you must maintain, but the natural expression of a woman who has reclaimed her inner kingdom piece by piece. In daily life, this sovereignty emerges not through dramatic declarations, but through the smallest gestures of fidelity to your inner truth. You pause before agreeing to something that drains you. You speak with clarity instead of pleasing. You protect your solitude because it nourishes the part of you that dreams, creates, and breathes. Even your gaze changes, no longer scanning for signs of disapproval, but resting lightly on the world, aware, discerning, quietly powerful. You are not harder, you are truer. And this truth radiates. It is not loud, but it is unmistakable. A man who encounters you now senses a different kind of presence, a woman whose roots run deep, whose value is self-generated, whose life is already rich with meaning. His fascination is not built on the fear of losing you as possession, but on the awe of encountering someone who has mastered the art of not abandoning herself. In his psyche, this awakens something ancient, the impulse not to control, but to rise. For men, too, carry an inner map toward wholeness, though many remain exiled from it. In your presence, they glimpse their own potential, an invitation not to dominate the feminine, but to meet it. Your sovereignty becomes a catalyst, not because you try to teach him, but because your very being transmits a forgotten truth, that love is most powerful when it is not born of need. This is why you are unforgettable. Not because you withhold affection, not because you perform indifference, not because you cultivate mystery. You are unforgettable because your eros circulates freely through your life instead of being siphoned into someone else's emptiness. You have become the subject of your story, not an accessory in someone else's. Your attention, your time, your devotion, these no longer flow automatically. They flow where your soul recognizes reciprocity. The men who once treated you as optional may return sensing the shift. Some will come with renewed desire, others with confusion. But you greet them from an entirely different psychic position. There is no bitterness, only clarity. You see them as they are without projecting fantasies or resurrecting old wounds. Your boundaries, once acts of effort, have become instinctive, organic, an extension of your nervous system. In this state, love no longer threatens to dismantle you because you are anchored from within. And here, at this altitude, a final understanding crystallizes. The journey was never about becoming more attractive to men. That was merely the outer layer of a much deeper psychological quest. The true work has always been the reclamation of the self, the slow, courageous disentangling of your identity from complexes, projections, inherited stories, and the ancient fear of being too much. You stand now at the threshold of a new life, not perfect, but profoundly your own. The underworld descent has given way to emergence. The shadows you confronted have become allies. The ancestral patterns you carried have loosened. The father complex, once a silent puppeteer, has been integrated into inner strength. And the creative libido, your eros, flows again through your voice, your choices, your relationships, your dreams. This is the essence of feminine sovereignty, to live a life so aligned with your inner truth that solitude becomes a sanctuary and companionship becomes a sacred choice. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are choosing. And the world responds differently to a woman who chooses. Because the deepest truth of all, the one that forms the axis of your entire journey, is this. Your worth is not something a man awakens. It is something your soul remembers. If these words resonate with your inner work, join this exploration of Jungian depth psychology and feminine consciousness. Like, share, and subscribe to continue traveling this path with a community devoted to profound psychological awakening.